His name could be summed up in just two words: the monster. Jeffrey Dahmer remains at the top of every list of America's most notorious serial killers. But what truly set him apart, what sent chills down the spines of even seasoned investigators, wasn't just the number of lives he took. It was what he did after. The twisted, grotesque acts he committed on the bodies of his victims after death were something far beyond murder. Depraved. Horrific. Sickening. Even these words fall short of describing the nightmare Dahmer created. In 2022, Netflix released a 10-part drama series about Dahmer's life. It wasn't a documentary, it was a dramatized retelling based on true events. Critics from major outlets praised the show for its terrifying accuracy and emotional weight. But let's not forget, it's still a piece of entertainment. A director has to amplify, condense, and reshape the truth to hold an audience. So if you've already watched the show, maybe you got a cinematic experience, one that pulled you into the story and showed you a certain perspective. But if you want the truth, if you want to stare into the darkest corners of this man's mind, analyze his psychology, and uncover the real horrors behind the name Jeffrey Dahmer, then stay with me. Today, we're digging deeper into the twisted reality behind the monster. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, into a middle-class family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His mother, Joyce Dahmer, was far from your typical mom. She suffered from severe depression, abused anti-anxiety medication, and showed signs of mental instability. Her condition placed enormous psychological pressure on Jeffrey, and their relationship was constantly strained, cold, volatile, and emotionally barren. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was a busy chemist who spent most of his time at work and was rarely home. Arguments were frequent. Affection was rare. It was a household soaked in silence and tension. And yet, Jeffrey formed an unusual bond with his father, built on a shared fascination: dissecting dead things. From a young age, Jeffrey and his dad would collect roadkill and animal carcasses near their home. They'd take them apart to study their anatomy. To Lionel, it was a form of scientific curiosity. But to Jeffrey, it became something far darker, an obsession he couldn't shake. His childhood was filled with emotional neglect and the cold, clinical imagery of dissection. By the age of 10, Jeffrey had already begun fantasizing about murder. He would later say that loneliness and feeling misunderstood made him retreat from the world and into his own mind. By the time he entered high school, Jeffrey was a shy, isolated kid. He was often bullied for being quiet and frail. He had no standout grades, no real achievements. But one thing did stand out: his drinking. By age 14, Jeffrey was an alcoholic. He drank in class. He drank at home. Alcohol quickly became his crutch, and eventually, the fuel that would ignite the monster inside. It was also during this period that he realized he was gay. But his desires didn't stop at love or attraction. What he craved most was control. And that's where things took a deadly turn. Jeffrey's fantasies weren't just about sex. They involved dismemberment, dominance, and death. He admitted to masturbating to vivid images of corpses, imagining total control over a lifeless body. This terrifying combination, emotional neglect, a fixation on dissection, and early alcoholism, was the perfect storm. These three elements became the foundation of the monster we now know as Dahmer: a broken, loveless childhood, a disturbing fascination with anatomy and death, and a deep-rooted addiction to alcohol. Starting in early adolescence, an FBI study once noted that most serial killers spend years fantasizing about murder before ever acting on it. So if you've ever had those kinds of thoughts, and especially if they excite you, be careful. Those aren't just passing ideas. They could be red flags, warnings of something much darker taking root. And the sooner you recognize them, the better chance you have to stop it before it's too late. In early 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer's parents finalized their divorce. His father moved out, and his mother, after winning custody, left too. She simply said, "He's 18. He can take care of himself." And just like that, Jeffrey was left completely alone in a quiet house in Ohio. In May of that same year, he graduated from high school. 3 weeks later, on June 18th, he took his first life. There was no master plan. The opportunity simply presented itself. Jeffrey was driving when he spotted Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker, on his way to a rock concert. Jeffrey offered him a ride, took him home, and the two drank beer, listened to music, and talked. Everything seemed normal, until Stephen said he wanted to leave. Jeffrey knew Stephen was straight. He knew he wasn't going to stay, and that was something Jeffrey couldn't accept. By the next morning, Stephen Hicks was dead. Jeffrey disposed of the body in a brutal, calculated manner. He dismembered Stephen, crushed the bones, and scattered the remains across the backyard. That first murder unfolded in total silence. No one suspected a thing. 6 years later, after Dahmer was finally caught, he confessed to killing Stephen. Police recovered the bone fragments exactly where he said they'd be. Without that confession, Stephen Hicks might have never been found. And that's the terrifying part. After taking his first life, Dahmer lived undetected for 6 more years. That silence, that invisibility, became the perfect foundation for what came next, a spree that would claim 16 more innocent lives. Psychological profile: what made Jeffrey Dahmer? Jeffrey Dahmer was not the kind of killer you could easily categorize. Even FBI profilers, people who had studied hundreds of murderers, struggled to make sense of him. There was something about Dahmer that didn't fit the usual molds. Something broken, but hard to define. Yes, his family was dysfunctional. Yes, his parents divorced and left him emotionally abandoned. But plenty of people grow up in broken homes and don't become murderers. The truth is, Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't shaped into a monster. The monster was always there. Those life circumstances simply unleashed it. Dahmer wasn't just a bad product of a bad environment. He was a deeply disturbed anomaly. The cracks in his psyche formed around 3 key things: abandonment, an obsession with dissection, alcoholism. From a young age, that feeling of being left behind haunted him. When Stephen Hicks said he wanted to leave, Jeffrey panicked. He couldn't handle someone walking out on him. So he made sure Stephen never could. He scattered Stephen's bones around his home, almost like he was trying to keep a part of him close. Not out of anger, not out of hatred, but out of sheer terror. Of being alone. That childhood fascination with dissection, first nurtured by his father, grew into a violent need. A need to dissect, understand, and possess a person completely. To make sure they would never, ever leave. And the alcohol? That was the fuel. Without it, Dahmer said he couldn't kill. It numbed his conscience and unlocked his predatory side. Diagnosis and the deepest paradox: many psychologists believe Dahmer had borderline personality disorder. People with BPD often fear abandonment, struggle with intense emotions, and act impulsively, often due to trauma in early life. And Jeffrey matched those symptoms almost exactly. But there was one chilling difference. Most people with BPD hurt themselves to draw sympathy or attention. Dahmer, he hurt others, so they could never leave him. His cruelty and lack of restraint went far beyond any typical diagnosis. Here's the deeper paradox. Despite being a serial killer, a cannibal, and someone who stored body parts in his fridge, Jeffrey Dahmer didn't meet the criteria for a clinical psychopath. He wasn't insane in the traditional sense. He wasn't emotionless. He wasn't purely evil in the Hollywood sense. He was something else, something darker, something we still don't fully understand. A black hole in the human psyche, one we've never been able to see the bottom of. The years after Jeffrey Dahmer's first kill, let's rewind the clock to August 1978, just 2 months after Jeffrey Dahmer had tasted blood for the first time. His father, Lionel Dahmer, still clung to a sliver of hope. He had enrolled Jeffrey in Ohio State University and even paid the tuition out of pocket. A fresh start. A second chance. Right? It was a devastating mistake. From the moment Jeffrey stepped onto campus, his apathy was obvious. He had no interest in school, no goals, no spark. What followed was a blur of alcohol and isolation. Despite being fully supported by his father, Jeffrey spent his days drunk. Within just 3 months, he dropped out. It was an early warning sign, one that most people overlooked. By January 1979, Lionel, watching his son spiral into chaos, made a bold decision. He forced Jeffrey to enlist in the U.S. Army. Jeffrey officially joined the military and was trained as a medic. It sounded promising, a strict, disciplined environment, a path to redemption. But during his time in the Army, Jeffrey learned something far more dangerous: how to use sleeping pills to sedate people. That skill would become a chilling tool in the horrors that followed. By 1981, Dahmer was discharged for excessive drinking and misconduct. Another door slammed shut. There were later allegations from 2 fellow soldiers that Jeffrey had sexually assaulted them during his service, but those claims remain unconfirmed, and we'll leave them aside for now. What's clear is this: after graduating high school, Jeffrey Dahmer spent the next few years sabotaging every opportunity he was given. Despite his father's unwavering support, he failed out of school, was kicked out of the Army, and drifted aimlessly through life like a ticking time bomb. In 1981, he was arrested for the first time, fined $60, and given 10 days in jail for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. Just another drunk. Nothing too alarming. Yet. In 1982, in a desperate attempt to rein him in, Lionel sent Jeffrey to live with his elderly grandmother in Wisconsin. A quieter environment. Closer supervision. Maybe this time it would work. But Jeffrey didn't change. On August 7th of that year, he was arrested again, this time for public intoxication and exposing himself at a crowded fairground, in full view of women and children. Disgusting. Though he continued living with his grandmother, Dahmer started frequenting gay bars and bathhouses, places that would later become his hunting grounds. Then in 1986, it happened again. Jeffrey was arrested for lewd behavior, this time masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys. He was sentenced to 1 year of probation. Yes, you heard that right. Two 12-year-old children. And all he got was a slap on the wrist. Through all of these incidents, a pattern becomes unmistakably clear. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just a troubled kid. He was a killer at 18. And for the next 9 years, he drifted deeper into addiction, perversion, and repeat run-ins with the law. At this point, we can't blame his parents anymore. Lionel Dahmer tried, desperately. He did everything he could to help his son. And yet it was never enough. There's no excuse, no tiny speck of sympathy to be found for a man like Jeffrey Dahmer. What's even more disturbing is how Netflix portrayed him in their series. In the show, Dahmer is depicted as awkward, even misunderstood. That version of him evokes pity. But the real Jeffrey Dahmer? He was reckless, perverted, contemptuous of the law, and almost entirely beyond rehabilitation. And the madness. This wasn't the peak. It was only the beginning. Because what came next was the darkest chapter of all. A killing spree so horrific, we may never stop being haunted by it. 1987, the blood trail begins. 1987 marked the beginning of Jeffrey Dahmer's full descent into madness. It had been 9 years since his first kill, but on November 20th, 1987, the monster awoke again. His second victim, 24-year-old Stephen Twomey. Dahmer lured Stephen to a hotel room, secretly spiked his drink with sleeping pills, and in the stillness of the night, carried out horrors that defied comprehension. The next morning, with Stephen's lifeless body lying beside him, Dahmer, chillingly calm, went out and bought a large suitcase. His goal? To dispose of the corpse. And disturbingly, he succeeded without raising a single alarm. Later, Dahmer would claim he had no memory of killing Stephen, that he was too drunk and too high to recall anything. Was that a weak excuse? Or a terrifying truth? We may never know. But according to Dahmer, this moment reawakened something inside him. He said it brought back the same feelings he had experienced 9 years earlier, arousal from dissection, a sick fascination with control, flesh, and death. And when such a crime went unnoticed so easily, it was as if the world had silently given him permission to keep going. He realized something horrifying. Murder was easy. And he wanted more. A calculated killer emerges just 2 months later. In January 1988, Dahmer struck again. His victim this time was 14-year-old James Dockstader. He met the boy at a gay nightclub, offering $50 in exchange for nude photos. He brought him home, while his grandmother slept upstairs, drugged him, and committed unspeakable acts. Murder became more familiar. And disposal. Routine. On March 24, 1988, just 2 months later, he killed again. The fourth victim, 25-year-old Richard Guerrero. Same method, same trap, same terrifying outcome. By now, Dahmer had refined his methods. He would go to clubs, offer $50, take the men home, drug them, and then kill them, all while living under the same roof as his grandmother. Then came victim number 5, and a critical mistake. The boy who escaped on September 25, 1988, Dahmer targeted 13-year-old Conorak Synthesumphone, a Laotian boy. He used the same trick, offering $50 for photos, and brought the boy home. But something went wrong. Even after being drugged, Conorak managed to escape. He ran back home, and his family rushed him to the hospital. Dahmer was arrested and charged with sexually assaulting a minor. This time, he was sentenced to 1 year in prison and 5 years of probation. But here's the shocker. His sentence didn't start until May 1989, 5 months later. You'd think a man waiting to go to jail would lay low. Jeffrey did the opposite. The Easter murder in March 1989, Dahmer was granted a 10-day furlough to spend Easter with his family before starting his sentence. And what did he do? On March 25th, just 5 days into his release, he killed again. His sixth victim, Anthony Sears, a promising young gay model. Dahmer claimed he was particularly attracted to Anthony, describing him as special. Despite being under surveillance and days away from prison, he couldn't resist the urge. He lured Anthony in, drugged him, and committed his most horrific acts yet. Prison changes nothing. Dahmer finally began his 1-year prison sentence in May 1989. He was released a year later, in May 1990, but was still under 5 years of probation. He moved into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee, and within days, he turned it into a slaughterhouse. On May 20th, 1990, just 6 days after being released, he murdered Raymond Smith. The $50 offer, the drugging, the killing, it all played out again. But this time, Dahmer added something new. He bought a Polaroid camera and began taking pictures of his victims before and after death. In June 1990, he killed Edward Smith. In September, he killed Oliver Lacey and began preserving body parts in his fridge. 3 weeks later, on September 24th, he killed David Thomas, but claimed he wasn't interested in him, so he disposed of the body entirely. That was the last murder of 1990. By then, Jeffrey Dahmer had transformed into a full-blown killing machine. He was addicted not just to murder, but to dissection, control, and preservation. A Mind in Ruin, Psychological Analysis 1991 would become Dahmer's most brutal year. But before diving into that carnage, let's pause to understand what was going on inside his twisted mind. Why the obsession with dissection? Some psychologists point to an extremely rare condition, slime coephalus syndrome, a disorder in which individuals experience sexual arousal from internal human organs. The glossy appearance, soft texture, and vulnerability of organs are believed to trigger associations with human sexuality, especially female anatomy. While still speculative and not well researched, this is one of the few scientific explanations for Dahmer's extreme and deviant urges. Whatever the cause, biological, psychological, or both, Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just a serial killer. He was a 1-in-a-million aberration, a man whose fantasies turned to rituals and whose rituals turned to horror. 1991. When the monster lost all control by 1991, the monster had completely taken over. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just killing, he was experimenting, collecting, and descending into a level of madness rarely seen in human history. Victims 11, 12, and 13, Anthony Hughes, Errol Lindsay, and Tony Sears, were murdered in rapid succession between February and May of that year. All were gay men lured to Dahmer's apartment with promises of money or companionship. Once inside, the story was always the same: drugged, killed, desecrated, photographed. Dahmer kept trophies, personal belongings, bones, and horrifyingly, photographs of their final moments. The zombie experiment with victim Errol Lindsay, Dahmer attempted something new. A horrific experiment he called his zombie state. He drilled into Errol's skull and poured acid directly into his brain, hoping to turn the man into a living, breathing, obedient shell. Errol survived the procedure, but not for long. Dahmer kept the body lying in his apartment for over 3 days before finally disposing of it in acid. And then came the 14th victim. A familiar face returns just days after Tony Sears was killed. While Tony's body still lay inside the apartment, Dahmer brought home another boy. His name? Conorak Synthesumphone. Yes, the younger brother of the boy who had escaped Dahmer's clutches just years before. Conorak was just 14 years old. Dahmer photographed the boy, half naked beside a fish tank, another shot on the couch. Then he drugged him and began yet another zombie experiment. Drilling, acid, hoping to erase consciousness but preserve obedience. After the procedure, Dahmer left the apartment to buy more alcohol. And that's when everything spiraled. Conorak woke up, confused, terrified, brain damaged but alive. Somehow, he staggered out of the apartment, naked, dazed, and bleeding. A tragic twist of fate out on the street. 2 women, Cleveland Smalls and her daughter, found the boy and immediately called 911. But as they waited for police to arrive, Jeffrey Dahmer came back. He approached calmly, claiming Conorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, and they had simply had a drunken fight. Cleveland tried to intervene, but the police told her to back off. When officers John Balserzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived, they believed Dahmer. Worse, they ignored Cleveland's pleas and scolded her for interfering. They escorted Conorak back into the apartment. Dahmer even showed them the Polaroids, half-naked photos of Conorak from earlier that night. And the officers, showing clear signs of homophobia and racial bias, told Dahmer to take good care of him, and left. That same night, Dahmer murdered Konarak. Deadly negligence, the police never checked Konarak's ID. If they had, they would have seen he was only 14. They didn't run a background check on Dahmer. If they had, they'd have found his conviction for sexually assaulting a minor, Konarak's own brother, just a few years earlier. They didn't even step into the apartment. Had they looked around, they would have seen Tony Sears' corpse, still rotting on the bed. Or worse, what was in the fridge. Because of their bias, their ignorance, and their homophobia, a young boy who escaped was sent right back into hell. And the killing didn't stop. Seeing how easily he fooled police, Dahmer realized one terrifying thing. He was unstoppable. He could kill at will. No one cared. And so, in just under a month, he took 4 more lives. June 30th, Matt Turner July 5th, Jeremiah Weinberger July 14th, Oliver Lacey July 19th, Joseph Braidhoff with Jeremiah. Dahmer boiled his brain using scalding water instead of acid. He was perfecting his zombie experiments, trying desperately to create a slave who would never leave him. But every attempt ended in death. His apartment became a revolving door of horror. Bodies piled up, some dismembered, some decomposing. The smell of death hung in the air. Jeffrey Dahmer had become completely unhinged, and soon he would pay the price. The end begins. Dahmer's final mistake on July 22, 1991. Jeffrey Dahmer attempted to claim his 19th victim just 4 days after the last murder. He lured Tracy Edwards to his apartment with the promise of $100 in exchange for modeling for some photos. But unlike previous times, Dahmer didn't use sedatives. Instead, he snapped a handcuff onto Tracy's wrist and pulled a large knife to control him. Despite his terror, Tracy stayed calm. He sensed something was deeply wrong, but rather than fight, he used his words. He kept repeating, "I won't leave you. I'm not going anywhere." It was genius because Dahmer had a deep-seated fear of abandonment. For 5 long hours, Tracy carefully played along, buying time, searching for an opening. And when that opening finally came, he punched Dahmer, stunning him, rushed to the door, and ran for his life. The monster gets caught. Tracy flagged down police and led them straight to apartment 213. Inside, officers found a drawer filled with disturbing Polaroids, pictures of men in twisted, mutilated poses. Some still fresh. It was enough for an immediate arrest. Jeffrey Dahmer confessed everything, calmly, in chilling detail. He had even kept ID cards of many victims, making it easier for police to confirm the total body count. 19 attempted murders, 2 survivors, 17 dead. But Dahmer was only charged with 16 life sentences. Why? Because in one case, his second kill, he claimed to be too drunk and couldn't remember what happened. There was no body, no physical evidence, and the court couldn't convict him for it. Still, whether it was 16 or 17, Dahmer would spend the rest of his life in prison. That is, unless he crossed paths with Christopher Scarver. Justice behind bars, the death of Jeffrey Dahmer inside prison. Dahmer became a marked man. His crimes weren't just murders, they were acts of horror against humanity. Other inmates wanted him dead. In July 1994, Dahmer was attacked. Someone slashed his throat with a razor blade. He survived. Barely. A warning shot. But then, in November 1994, fate came back swinging. Dahmer was assigned to cleaning duty with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. While the guards stepped away, Scarver struck. He grabbed a metal bar from a weight bench, bludgeoned both Dahmer and Anderson to death. Scarver's reason: Scarver was severely mentally ill. When asked why he did it, he said Dahmer and Anderson had mocked him. Others said Scarver hated Dahmer for a more specific reason. Dahmer would shape his food into body parts, pour ketchup over it to mimic blood, and laugh. Even in prison, Dahmer couldn't help but taunt people with his cannibalism. Scarver snapped, and in the end, a murderer died at the hands of another. Poetic justice. There's an eerie twist to Dahmer's death. Remember his first victim? Back when Dahmer was just 18, he killed him using a metal bar from a weight bench. And in the end, that same weapon became the one that ended him. The object that started his killing spree was also the one that brought it to a close. A full circle of horror. The monster met his end with the same tool he once used to create monsters of his own. The final reflection, what the monster left behind. We've now walked through the entire nightmare that was Jeffrey Dahmer's story, from his troubled childhood to the disturbing fantasies, the brutal killings, and the grim end behind bars. But here's a hard truth we must face. Yes, Jeffrey Dahmer had a lonely, broken childhood. But when he became an adult, he made his choices, horrifying, conscious, and deadly choices. No one forced him. No trauma justifies what he became. He abandoned school, jobs, and even the people who tried to help him, like his father. He rejected the law, flaunted his twisted desires, and used others for pleasure, never once caring about the consequences. Some try to blame his actions on mental illness or childhood neglect. But if we're honest, it's clear. Everything he did was about feeding his own perversions. The Netflix series on Dahmer painted him as lonely, misunderstood. And unfortunately, that image sparked sympathy from some viewers. But let's be real. Was he lonely? Of course, because he murdered everyone around him. You can't break every rule of society and expect to belong to it. Dahmer wasn't misunderstood. He was monstrous. He alienated himself, not because society failed him, but because he failed society. So let's save our empathy for those who truly deserve it. A mind beyond repair, Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just violent. He was psychologically broken in ways that still puzzle experts. Yes, he showed signs of slime coephalus, borderline personality disorder, but psychologists also believe he suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder. He had constant, intrusive thoughts of murder. And like most OCD sufferers, he tried to relieve anxiety by acting on those urges, in his case, through killing. He admitted, "I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop." And he likely had schizoid personality disorder, which meant he felt no desire for close relationships, no connection to others, and no care for social norms. SCPD often stems from emotionally cold or neglectful childhoods. Sound familiar? Was Dahmer a psychopath? For years, Dahmer was not officially labeled psychopath. But modern psychologists like Dr. Todd Grande disagree. They say he fits the profile perfectly. YouTube channel Optimum, which specializes in body language, analyzed his interviews. They found no genuine remorse. At times, he showed embarrassment but never guilt. He knew what he was doing. He just didn't care. The bigger picture, what enabled this? Yes, Dahmer was the killer. But he was not alone in his responsibility. Police negligence, racial bias, homophobia, and systemic indifference, all of these gave Dahmer the shadows he needed to thrive. 17 young men and boys paid the ultimate price. May we never forget that justice delayed is not justice denied, but it's still painful as hell for the victims' families. Thankfully, those families eventually got justice. And the kindest thing we can do is honor them, not him. On the Netflix show. And Dangerous Sympathy, yes, the Netflix series was powerful. Yes, it told a story that needed telling. But there's something deeply disturbing about how it glorified Dahmer for some viewers. Fan clubs, T-shirts, crushes. That's not justice. That's ignorance. And no, his death in prison was not justice, either. Some say Scarver was karma, the hand of justice in human form. But let's not forget, Scarver was a murderer too. A mentally unstable one. Real justice would have been keeping Dahmer alive in a cell where he could never kill again, never feed his addictions again, and spend the rest of his days staring into the darkness he created. That's the justice we believe in, because it shows we're better than the monsters we lock away. So what can we learn? 17 lives were lost, and from their stories we must learn. Let's fix broken systems that ignore the vulnerable, prejudices that blind justice, and fascination we sometimes give to evil. Let's remember the victims, not the killer. What's the biggest lesson you take away from this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because we have more dark mysteries to uncover. Together. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. See you in the next one.